Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podcast, The Joyful Frugalista. And now here's your host, Serina Bird.
This podcast is brought to you by The Joyful Fashionista, an online marketplace for buying and selling secondhand and sustainable clothing. Make cash selling as you declutter or buy sustainable and fabulous fashion. Humour Frugalistas, and welcome. Today I have a special guest, and of course all of my guests are special. Today's guest is someone who knows a lot of knowledge about personal finances and has written not one, but 5 books about money. Emily Guy Birken has worn lots of hats throughout her career. Temporary tattoo artist, bookseller, Americorps volunteer and teacher. She's also a huge money nerd. In 2010, she turned her excitement about spreadsheets into a career, and she's now a Plutus Award-winning freelance writer in the financial sphere. Her work has appeared in HuffPo, Business Insider, Kiplinger's Personal Finance, MSN Money, and The Washington Post. So these are the 5 books she's authored, just to get a sense for just how incredible her knowledge base is. The 5 years before you retire, Choose Your Retirement, Making Social Security Work for You, End Financial Stress Now, and the newly released book, Stacked, Your Super Serious Guide to Modern Money Management, which she has co-written with Joe Saul-Sehy. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being on this podcast. As I said to you earlier, I'm just a huge fan of your work from here in Australia, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom with the Joyful Frugalista listeners.
I'm so glad to be here.
So you've had just such an amazing money career, and obviously you didn't quite start out like that from the beginning. So how did you get to writing about money?
I like to tell people that I tripped and fell backwards into it. So because I'm actually an English teacher by training, I majored in English and French literature because I was very woefully literary in my early 20s. Then I ended up getting a master's degree in English education, and I taught high school English for 4 years. And then because I'm really good at timing, my husband and I decided to move because he got a new job after my 4th year of teaching, when I was also pregnant with our first child, who was due at the beginning of the next school year. Mm-hmm. So because of all of that, I knew I was not going to get a teaching job right away, because even though they couldn't legally not hire me, no one was going to hire me to immediately go on maternity leave. Mm-hmm. So the original plan was that I was just going to stay home with the baby for 1 year and then go back to the classroom. In addition to my wonderful timing in terms of when we decided to move and have a kid, we also had trouble selling our first house. It took us 11 months to sell the house that we left behind in Columbus, Ohio. We went from 2 incomes to 1, 2 family members to 3, 1 mortgage to 2. Things were a little tight. So I decided to start looking for some work that I could do from home. I have always been a writer, and I was like, all right, I'll do some freelance writing. Just bring a little bit of money in, kind of help ease the burden of what we're going through right now. And one of the first writing gigs that I landed was for a financial website. That was not my expectation or intention at all. I thought I'd be writing about education, parenting, travel, food, all of the usual things that you think of. But my father was a financial planner, so I grew up in the industry. And so this wasn't completely out of nowhere for me. And I've always been, as I said, a money nerd. Never occurred to me that my money nerdery could be something I could make a career. Several pieces for that financial website, 1 or 2 of them kind of went mini viral. I mean, like viral in the financial world, which means, tens of people saw them. It was amazing.
I'm sure a lot more than that, but yeah, I know what you mean. For a long time in Australia too, finance wasn't cool, but now we've had a book, sadly not mine, but the Barefoot Investor, that's had over 1 million copies sold. I think they're probably closer to 2 now. And I think it really took the bookseller world by surprise, because they didn't expect that a finance topic would do so well. But I think what they hadn't realised was just how many Australian families in particular were really struggling.
Yes. Yeah. And that's something that I've seen over and over again, is there's this sense of finance is one thing. It's this very dry, nerdy thing. And so it doesn't sell books. It doesn't make viral videos or viral blog posts. And that's really not what it is. I mean, that's what it is and what's traditionally finance may have been. But I think in part because of the internet, there's this big opening up of new voices in the financial sphere. And I think that was part of what helped me kind of get traction early on, was that editor liked my work and passed my name to his friends, invited me to the first FinCon, which is a financial media conference that's been going on since 2011.
To go this year, and I'm really excited about it. And I don't know anyone, so I'm especially excited to meet you. And while we're on the topic of FinCon, I understand you have won a really important award through FinCon.
Yes. So Plutus Awards, and there is a Plutus Foundation, and there's just a incredible ecosystem around the Plutus Foundation. It is named after, I believe, a Greek god of money. It's one of those, like, I thought I knew the Greek myths pretty well, but that's not what I'm familiar with. And so it started in, I believe, 2010 was the very first Plutus Awards. It was a very natural fit where it joined up with FinCon in 2011 for that first year of FinCon. So that was the second annual Plutus Awards, but the first ever FinCon in 2011. And so this award, there are categories in all types of places. There's different blog types. So family finance, single people finance, dual income, no kids. Then there's like investing blogs, millennial money blogs, blogs for parents. I mean, just, all of these different categories. And then there's for podcasting, there's for vlogging, there's for books, freelancing, and just anything in the financial media sphere. And I was very, very gratified and just overwhelmed to win the award for Best Freelancer of the Year in 2018.
Congratulations, and well deserved.
Thank you. Thank you. And so that was just overwhelming. It just never occurred to me that would happen.
Well, you obviously had done a great job about it, and also done a great job in terms of making your money nerdiness, for one of a better term. And I know they use that a lot in FinCon, so I'm not suggesting you personally are a nerd at all.
I self-identify.
Self-identify, but well done in terms of making that a full-time gig and sharing so much wisdom with so many people.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's been a wild ride, and I can't imagine a better career for myself, honestly. There are aspects of being a teacher that I miss very much. I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.
You're still educating. That's the thing. Like, education comes in all different forms. And do you feel that you draw on your teaching skills in different ways?
Oh, very much. Yes. So I know that if I had tried to become a freelance writer before being a teacher, it would have been a lot harder to get where I am. And that's partially because teaching helped me hone a bunch of skills that I think are really necessary when you're writing about something that is not necessarily everyone's cup of tea. So I learned how to kind of get my students excited and interested in Shakespeare when that is not at all what they want to be doing. And I figured out ways to get them interested even with stuff like grammar, which is, nobody likes grammar. But I found ways to make it funny or silly or shocking, or even just a kind of routine that became like enjoyable because they were used to it. They knew what to expect. And so having that experience really helps me figure out ways to write about money, particularly the things that people don't want to talk about, by bringing in something that's funny or silly or shocking or helps people feel comfortable in a routine. That is all things that I know I didn't understand about writing prior to being a teacher.
So moving on from, or building on rather, from this concept of making seemingly boring things funny, this is something you obviously do very well in your writing, which brings me to your latest book, which, as you know, is titled Stacked, Your Super Serious Guide to Modern Money Management. So how super serious is the book?
So the book title, I'll tell you, we decided to call it Stacked, which we'd finished the book. We knew the title. It was in production. I was having a conversation with my sister, and she says to me, like, you do know stacked means big boobs, right?
Well, I didn't know that, but I do now.
So, and we're like, yes, we were kind of going for the ambiguity of the title. But we knew we needed to have a subtitle, and our editor suggested Your Funny Guide to Modern Money Management. And Joe, my co-author, and I both said, like, if you have to say it about yourself, it's not true. So if you say that your book is funny, then it's not true. So the same thing so we decided, like, let's flip that. Let's call it Your Super Serious Guide to Modern Money Management. Because if we have to say it's super serious, it's clearly not true.
Well, I was sort of not quite sure what to expect, but just even flicking through the chapter headings, I was like, oh my gosh, these people actually say this.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories about writing the book is a friend of Joe's asked him, like, after we turned in the draft and we're getting ready for the first round of edits. He was like, so like, how many of the dick jokes did you write? He said to Joe. And Joe was like, surprisingly, almost none of them. Emily wrote almost all of them.
Well,
and that is one other thing about having been a high school teacher. My sense of humor, I mean, I know that it has progressed from when I was 14, but there's still a little part of me that has that. I don't know if you remember Beavis and Butthead, but from MTV in the 90s.
I do. I'm wearing a Red Hot Chili Pepper shirt or pullover, as you'd say, as we are podcasting. So yes, I do remember.
So there is a part of me that still just goes. So particularly because I am most known for writing about retirement. And so I will talk about retirement withdrawal strategies. And I have to take a minute every time about like the most responsible withdrawal strategies.
Well, we actually have a bit of that sort of level of humor in my household because I have two boys and my husband is also a bit of a big child. So everything I say has to be censored. But, why not have fun with money? Like, why does it have to be so serious?
Yeah. Well, and that's part of where we're coming from for this is that we want money to be something that people think about with humor, with lightheartedness, an acceptance of mistakes rather than treating everything like it's life or death. One of the things I like to tell people is if you think of money as only slightly less fun than a colonoscopy, you're never going to deal with it. So
that is so true. And you say to people, you need a budget, and you can just see them freaking out. Like even the word freaks people out.
Yes.
I tend to flip it when I work with people and say, let's just not talk about it being budget. Let's just pretend it's a forecasting tool. Put someone else's name on it. Just have a bit of fun with it. But it is really hard because you sort of feel so much judgment about how you deal with money, how much money you have, how much money you don't have.
Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting about writing about money and like being immersed in the financial media sphere is the moment you realize that money doesn't really exist. So it doesn't exist in nature. You can't eat it. You can't wear it. You can't build a house out of it. You can't even spend it outside of where it's accepted as legal tender. It's actually just this delusion that we have all decided to share. And when you start thinking about that, I mean, some of this sounds like you're in your freshman dorm room going like, whoa. But that is really the truth because it's this thing that doesn't exactly exist, but we are all tied to it and required to use it. And for good reason, because if we were stuck with bartering, like nothing would get done. It would be impossible. But because there's no like one meaning of what money is, we put our own meaning on it. We put our own neuroses, our own psychology, our own childhood trauma, our own mistakes, our own emotional issues. And so that means that something that could be relatively simple becomes very complicated because it's about how we feel about it rather than about how we can use it. And because we're so immersed in it, it's like, the fish not understanding the question of how's the water. Because we're so immersed in it, we don't recognize that this is something that we are putting on money instead of it being an immutable fact about money. And oftentimes, we most often will see that when people get into a long-term relationship, get married or something like that, where all of a sudden your two different meanings of money are butting heads.
Yeah. And then you have children and all those money issues come up as well, inherited beliefs.
Yes, exactly. And that's when people actually start going like, well, wait a minute, we can't do that because that's not how money works. And the other person's like, of course, that's how money works. We have to do that. And that is often the first time that we really recognize that there is a difference in how people treat money. And unfortunately, because as a society, we don't like talking about money, we don't often go from there to be like, oh, okay, I'm putting my assumptions, you're putting your assumptions. Let's like try to let go of any assumptions that are harmful and build some assumptions together that are going to help us. We tend to be like, no, you're wrong, I'm right. And because we don't talk about it and we don't have a context for kind of letting go of these stressful assumptions that we're making and finding a way to mesh with our significant other or, whatever's going to work in our lives better.
How do we go about then talking about money? And given that there are different values around money and there's different assumptions you go into a relationship, how then do you start having those conversations?
It's really tough. And I think it's helpful to start in a way that's like, again, you don't want to like, all right, let's sit down and talk money. This is going to be, serious
conversation. You are spending too much money and you are the problem. Yes. I mean, that's not going to go very well for a relationship, is it?
Exactly. And that's often how things, I can remember early in our marriage, I was going to a cousin's wedding and I had gotten this gorgeous dress.
I knew where this was headed.
Well, the dress was from a thrift store. So I was really proud of it. I spent like no more than like $30 on the dress, but then I needed shoes to go with it. And the shoes were going to be $80. Not a small amount of money for a pair of shoes I was going to wear once. Mm-hmm. But in my head, the way that I think of money is like you show up for family, you spend what you need to spend to make it clear how much you care. Spending money on family events like weddings, that's important. Like that's worth eating ramen for a few weeks if you have to. Not that we were in that kind of situation, but that is the way that I was raised to view money. Whereas my husband, when I came home with he was super psyched that I found a $30 gorgeous dress, but came home with $80 shoes and he's just like, oh my goodness, what is going on? How are we going to deal with this? And I was just like, it's my cousin's wedding. I have to have these shoes. And we just couldn't comprehend each other. And so those sorts of things, they're going to happen and it's going to be helpful. Now he was more of the like, I don't understand rather than like, this is wrong, which was very, very helpful. And coming at it from a like, this doesn't make sense to me, help me understand, I think is really, really a great way to approach it. And is tough because money is such a sensitive issue.
Yeah.
It is something that can really trigger our fears and concerns. I could definitely tell he wasn't pleased, but he was not coming at it as like, oh my goodness, this is going to ruin things. What about our budget or anything like that?
Because it could have been very easy for him to have come home and said, oh, those shoes are ugly. How dare you spend this money? Don't you know how important our finances mean? You always do this. It could have been any of the above.
Yeah. And so that, I think that was the first time I really had an understanding of how different our value systems were. Because for the most part, we meshed pretty well. I had a similar thing several years later. Another cousin of mine got married and was taking some time I made her a quilt and was taking some time away from my paid work to work on the quilt. And my husband was just like, is that really? And I'm like, this is my cousin's getting married. She needs this wonderful present. That was the first time, because otherwise we were very much in alignment on like how we feel about family, how we feel about money, spending, things like that. But there are these differences and they are going to cause friction sometimes.
Oh yeah, I hear you. We booked on a very expensive cruise for December and it's because my mother-in-law really wanted to go. She really, really wanted to go with the family. And my husband has very strong family values. And he's like, my parents are old. They're not going to be with us forever. And cruises really mean a lot to her. So I sort of went, I have a value around, I didn't go on a lot of holidays when I was growing up. And I was a single parent for a long time after going through domestic violence. So we didn't have a lot of spare money. So I'm like, save. So that was very challenging for me. But I have to understand that was the different value and where he's coming from. And I'm sure it'll be a fabulous, albeit very expensive cruise.
Yeah. And that's what I have also found, like it was, I think probably about a year after the shoe wedding incident, it was completely unrelated. Like I wasn't even thinking about this, but my husband and I were on a road trip, and we have this bad habit of, you put me in a car for more than 4 hours, tears will at some point I'll start crying. And so we try to avoid that. So I don't know what it is, something about long road trips.
That is really unusual. I've never heard of that before.
I think what it is like, 4 hours is my limit in a car. And after that, I'm just like, I just don't want to be in here anymore. So once we had podcasts, because this was back in the early 2000s. So like if you didn't have a good curated CD collection, or you're like whatever, or if you're driving an older car that didn't have a good radio or anything like that, I think it had more to do with that. Because now that we've got books on audio, we've got podcasts, we've got, music on demand, doesn't happen anymore. I think it's really like my boredom level at 4 hours is just too much. So we were trying very hard to avoid that. So we're trying to have like fun, like car games. One, and I think he's the one who suggested it. He was just like, all right, let's like top 10 vacation destinations. Like, where do you want to travel to in your life? Go. And we went back and forth, like, I want to go here. I want to go here. And we spent like just a delightful 2 hours just talking about the places we wanted to go. Well, his number one destination is the Le Mans 24-hour car race in Le Mans, France. So he's an automotive engineer, got his start because he was interested in Formula One racing. And so he loves the idea of the just engineering challenge of this race. I love the idea of France. So I was like, let's do this. So it was about a week later after the end of that road trip, I said, how about we start setting money aside every month so that we can go to Le Mans sometime. And he's like, okay, I don't know. I mean, like he doesn't think about saving money the way that I do. And he doesn't like kind of project ahead the way that I do. But that's kind of how I do things. And so I was like, all right, let's do this. We're just, $100 a month. We can spare that. We'll put it into a high yield savings account and just kind of see where it goes. And so we did. And after a few years, we had quite a bit of money there. Unfortunately, after a few years, we also had children who were very picky. So we haven't been yet.
But you've got the money that's set aside to do that.
Yes. And so by seeing how well that worked, that actually really brought him on board with the way that I handled money, because it just never occurred to him that this could work the way that it did, that it could, we could quietly, without really thinking about it and without it affecting our day-to-day living, set money aside so that we could do something really fun later on. And so once that kind of was going, we started applying it to other things that maybe weren't as much fun. For instance, he had a home equity line of credit for the house that he lived in when we first got married. I was like, I'm uncomfortable having that home equity line of credit. I'd like us to work on getting that paid off. For a while, we lived on his income and used mine to pay off the HELOC. And that was something where it just hadn't occurred to him that you could do that. And so doing these things kind of helped bring him on board with the way that I do things. And then being open about these conversations helped me see things from his point of view that I wouldn't have noticed if we hadn't had these conversations.
Yeah, it is amazing how when you set a goal, how things do build up and how those little bits do make a difference. Here in Australia, we have something called superannuation, and my husband has a very good work superannuation, but there's a particular quirk about it that there's a particular limit and he can't contribute anymore. So he set up a second fund and he has put a very small amount into that. He's been doing that now for 4 years, 2 years. We just set and forget, and we're just always amazed at how it just sort of gathers momentum. And we're like, we don't even miss that money. And he can't access it until he's 60 years of age. But, that'll be a cruise, or that'll be a trip to Europe, or that'll be something that we haven't even missed that money at all, and it'll be there.
Yeah. It's so hard to wrap your head around like how much little bits add up, and particularly with compound interest. I feel like you can only really understand compound interest in the rearview mirror. Like, I remember when I was in high school, my freshman year of high school, my social studies teacher had a class lesson about compound interest. And if anyone in that class was going to get it, it was going to be me. And I remember thinking like, oh, this is really interesting, but I did not feel the urgency of it.
No, you don't.
And I don't know if there's any way to help people understand the urgency of it, because it's something where you understand it so much better in the rearview mirror when you go like, oh, wow, I was only setting aside like $50 every other week. And look at how much it's worth now. Whereas at the time you're like, it's $50 or it's just a little bit of money. What's it going to matter? And it's very, very hard to look at it in a forward way. Whereas when you can look at it from the rear view, you go like, oh, wow, that did something huge. And I couldn't have imagined or predicted that at the beginning.
Yeah. And it's so easy to go, well, I'll just wait till I've got a better job, or I'll just wait until my kids grow up, or I just wait until this. Or you really have to start now, don't you?
Oh, yes. Yes.
So I have one final question for you, which is, do you have a Frugalista tip to share? I'm sure you have lots and lots of tips for sharing money, but do you have something, perhaps something funny, perhaps something quirky, or perhaps something you use frequently at home?
So I think my biggest Frugalista tip is actually kind of counterintuitive, which is figure out what you want to spend money on. So something that you always feel good about spending money on. And then that makes it easier to let go of the things that don't matter so much. For me, I have a couple things that I really like. It doesn't matter how much I have. I'm always happy to get more. And that's fun socks, blank notebooks. I live by the credo that she who dies with the most blank notebooks wins. And funny mugs. And so that is something where like I like knowing that those are the things where like if I feel like I want to buy myself something to spend money, for one thing, all three of them are relatively low cost. But for another, I know that that's something that's going to make me feel good. Whereas if I didn't know that, I might go chasing that feeling with like a chocolate chip cookie, which feels good at the time, but an hour later, I'll be like, I wish I hadn't done that. Or I might try for something that's new clothes or something else. So that for me is, I think, the basis of being frugal is figuring out what is worth it to spend money on for you. And then that you can let go of everything else. So if something catches your eye, you're like, ooh, that looks cute. And then you go, would that make me as happy as like the last time I purchased a blank notebook? No, I don't think it would. All right, I don't need it.
Then you've got to be aware of all the blank notebooks.
Yes.
Because you can always word people up. And the thing is, when they know that what you like, they know you like notebooks, then you tend to get them for presents.
I do. And I actually, the other thing about having so many blank notebooks is I sometimes will give them away too. So I'll have them and sometimes I'll be like, oh, this one would be perfect for my friend Natalie. And like, that'll, and so that's also an aspect of it. It's one of the reasons why I like having these sorts of, the same thing with mugs. I don't give my socks away, but if I have this ridiculous mug with a mermaid on it that says strong women make waves. And I have this feeling like I'm going to meet someone who needs it more than I do, and I will pass it along. And those sorts of things, I think, are just, you're going to have a lot more fun and you're going to feel, and frugality is going to feel more like freedom if you have these like line items in your budget where you can say yes.
So say yes to the things that bring you joy. Love it.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being my guest. Now, a lot of my readers in Australia are probably wanting to know where to reach you. I'm not sure if your new book is available in Australia yet, but you can still buy it from Amazon and have it shipped from the US. And hopefully they'll bring out a Kindle or electronic version.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, I have very little control over that aspect of it, but I will definitely let my publisher know that there are people in Australia who are waiting
really
for the Kindle
like to read it, and I
version.
really have. And Australians have quite a cheeky sense of humour, so I think they would really get your book. At least we would in our household.
Yes, that would be amazing. So, well, I do want to let your listeners know that if you go to my website, emilyguyburken.com/TJF for the Joyful Frugalista, I have a welcome page there, and I'll have a couple of different PDFs. One is about figuring out what money means to you. And there's also links for how to buy my books and also how to reach me. So that welcome page is specifically for your listeners. But you can also reach me on Twitter at Emily Guy Birken. I'm also on Instagram at Emily Guy Birken, and on Facebook, and it's author Emily Guy Birken.
Thank you so much. That's a very generous offer for the listeners of The Joyful Frugalista. Thank you so much for being my guest, and for the listeners out there, if you've enjoyed this podcast as much as I have and have laughed as much as I have, please join the Joyful Frugalista Facebook group and participate in the conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Joyful Frugalista with Serina Bird, and of course sound has been by Neil Hadley.
You could talk, I would listen, I would understand your mind. Oh, I long to be with you, walking toward the sea, and the times when I'm lonely, you could be the one to comfort me every day. I am thankful that our separate paths have crossed. Every night I lay my head down, I know I'll never feel so lost. What if we crossed the river? We could start